Cows in feedlots, chickens in broiler sheds, livestock trucks full of animals. When you drive across the country, the signs of cruelty of Big Ag are everywhere. Hi, it's Emil Guillermo, your host of the PETA Podcast. We're on the road and seeing it all from the interstate, but it's amazing how many states just don't want you to see or know about what happens to factory-farmed animals in the ag business. I've driven through the heartland, states like Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa in the last few weeks. Many of these states want to not just muzzle animal rights activists, but keep any information from the consumer. Ag-Gag laws have sprung up, and PETA has fought them, believing you should know more about the cruelty in your food. So driving cross-country reminded us that you should hear how PETA won the fight in Iowa and continues to fight Ag-Gag in other states. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, a victory for PETA. An Iowa federal court declares an Ag-Gag law unconstitutional.
These Ag-Gag laws are trying to prohibit anybody from filming any illegal activity, no matter how heinous. In fact, these laws are clearly designed and directed to thwart PETA's investigation. We've had legislatures in Utah, in Iowa, and some of these other states on the floor of the legislature, singling out PETA and animal activists by name and clearly admitting that these laws are designed to try to stop the bad press and the public image hit that these industries take when PETA releases this information. And people see chickens having their head banged against concrete walls and having cinder blocks dropped on their heads.
Jeff Kerr, PETA Foundation General Counsel and Senior VP of Corporate Affairs, on the cruelty PETA investigators saw, but were not allowed to speak about due to Iowa's Ag-Gag law. Now that a federal court in Iowa has declared the law unconstitutional, what impact will that have on the industry as PETA exposes the truth about how animals are treated in factory farms? More with Jeff Kerr on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. Is going vegan one of your resolutions? Find out how. PETA's vegan mentors are here to help. It's in episode 25. Still wondering about ditching your Canada Goose jacket? Stay warm and vegan. Listen to episode 44. And animal testing is always an important issue. Find out how it's just a welfare system for scientists in episode 11. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, there's a link to a survey in our show notes. If you're so inclined, please fill it out. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. More on PETA's victory in Iowa over the Ag-Gag law and how free speech rights and animal rights proved to be an unbeatable combination in the quest for justice. Here's my conversation with PETA Foundation General Counsel Jeff Kerr on the PETA Podcast. So, Jeff, first of all, Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, and to you.
You're starting off the new year right. You've got this huge victory involving the Ag-Gag law. Tell me where the victory was and what exactly happened.
Sure. Well, the victory occurred in federal court in Iowa, and specifically what the court ruled was that Iowa's Ag-Gag law is an unconstitutional infringement on PETA's freedom of speech in conducting undercover investigations and disseminating the results of those investigations to authorities and the public. And specifically, these Ag-Gag laws have been enacted in several states, and we are challenging them wherever they exist. And they are designed specifically to try to thwart undercover investigations. And they do that by trying to criminalize or create severe civil penalties for people getting jobs at places and videoing, recording the evidence of horrific abuse that is inflicted on animals at these facilities. And so the court, this is the third court to do it, has found that because those activities of getting employment and recording illegal behavior is preparatory to speaking about it, that these laws infringe the First Amendment.
Right. So basically, the courts were saying that this was an unconstitutional way of silencing people who want to speak, protest, let the public know about something that's going on in the agricultural business, hence Ag-Gag, the term. Who coined that, by the way?
It's been out there ever since the first one of these came about. I think it was originally coined in a media article, but it certainly is appropriate. This is the kind of critical investigative reporting that goes back to the days of Upton Sinclair and the Jungle, in which he exposed the horrors of the food industry, and that led directly to the enactment of the first food safety law. So, and Iowa and these other states who have enacted these statutes should really be ashamed of themselves, that they're trying to keep this information from the consuming public. The people have a right to know about how animals are treated and unfortunately abused in the preparation of their food.
Ag-Gag, I've always found to be a clever way to say something that has really serious ramifications for farmed animals. So explain to our listeners about, now that this law has been ruled unconstitutional, what does it mean for consumers or citizens of Iowa? By being ruled unconstitutional, what happens now?
Once the time to appeal runs, then based upon this ruling, the law will effectively be a nullity and will not be enforceable. So that's the import of it. And the real substance of this victory is that it continues to allow PETA and anybody else, journalists, investigative reporters, other groups, including labor groups as well, who are concerned about working conditions. It allows them to continue doing what PETA has done for nearly the entire 40 years of its existence, and that is conduct these investigations to disclose things like, for example, supervisors shoving canes into sows' genital areas, striking them with those canes, beating pigs with metal grates, using turkeys like footballs and kicking them in bird slaughterhouses, and other horrors, so that the consuming public can make the humane and ethical choice to avoid consuming those products, because consumers are rightly outraged by that. And in fact, far from trying to prohibit people from investigating these cruelties and exposing them, they should be placing cameras inside these facilities so that people can see on a daily basis what happens.
They don't do that now, putting closed-circuit cameras up.
Oh, no. It's quite the opposite with these Ag-Gag laws. They're trying to prohibit anybody from filming any illegal activity, no matter how heinous. In fact, these laws are clearly designed and directed to thwart PETA's investigation. We've had legislatures in Utah, in Iowa, and some of these other states on the floor of the legislature, singling out PETA and animal activists by name and clearly admitting that these laws are designed to try to stop the bad press and the public image hit that these industries take when PETA releases this information and people see chickens having their head banged against concrete walls and having cinder blocks dropped on their heads, these kinds of things, which are all some of the examples that we found during our investigations of it.
Now, I can understand why companies would not want to publicize any of this or want people to know about this. But now legislators who pass these laws in states like Iowa, wouldn't they want to know if laws were being violated? I mean, that's a puzzler to me. They're the people who are supposed to uphold the laws, make sure that these cruelty laws are followed. Why would they want to give a pass to the ag business? Are they that powerful, the ag business lobbyists?
Hugely powerful. And you have to remember that Iowa, for example, is the largest pig raising state in the country. And so it's going to have, the largest number of instances of abuse and cruelty inflicted on pigs of any state. But what you see in these Ag-Gag laws is the nefarious intersection of money and politics. And so the agriculture industry has big money, and they are funding the campaigns of the legislators in these states who are doing their bidding, and it's that plain. In fact, the reason there's great similarity between a number of these Ag-Gag laws from state to state is because the laws themselves were drafted by the agriculture industry lobbying group and peddled around to the various state legislatures.
So it's kind of like a boilerplate kind of law that is approved by the ag industry and pass it around to different states and say, here it is, here's your model.
That's exactly right.
What are the factory farms? What are the legislators trying to help them hide specifically? What just lay out the cruelty charges that PETA's found.
Sure, I can give you some specific examples, but by way of general background, it's important to know that PETA's investigations have led to the first ever convictions for felony cruelty to animals, to workers on pig farms, to workers on in bird slaughterhouses, and numerous other facilities. For example, in a 1998 investigation of a pig breeding factory farm in North Carolina that resulted in felony indictments of workers, there were daily beatings of pregnant sows with a wrench and an iron pole to skinning pigs alive and sawing off conscious animals' legs. In 2001, we did an investigation of a pig farm in Oklahoma that resulted in the first conviction for felony animal cruelty after our investigation showed employees there routinely throwing, beating, kicking, and slamming animals against concrete floors and bludgeoning them with metal gate rods and hammers. And a 2008 investigation of a factory farm at a turkey processing facility resulted in the first ever felony indictments for farmed poultry and the first factory and of factory farmers for abusing turkey when they were, as I mentioned earlier, using them like footballs and kicking them and swinging them by their legs to bash their head against the walls. This is the kind of blatant cruelty that is endemic in the industry and that we have found every time we've done an investigation at a facility like this across every state where we've investigated.
And it's all against the law, right? I mean, there are cruelty laws that prohibit these kind of actions specifically.
That's right. The difficult situation is that because there is no federal oversight, there is no federal law protecting animals in slaughter facilities. We are limited to pursuing these atrocities through state cruelty laws. And that's why it's so important that the state legislatures are trying to hide it through state law, through state ag-gag laws, to prevent prosecutions under their state cruelty statute.
So the feds, the USDA doesn't get in on this. There's no federal oversight.
That's right. Not at this stage, and not in relation to these activities involving animals. And it's an outrage, but that's the circumstance we're left with. And of course, that, in our view, makes it all the more important for groups like PETA to be able to continue to conduct these investigations and to expose this kind of conduct.
Well, so it's a patchwork quilt that you have to start building state by state, it seems, or legislature by legislature. And it would seem to me that you're fighting the lobbyists, at every turn here at every state. Wouldn't it be easier to try to move for some kind of federal law, or are the lobbyists that powerful on the federal level if they are dealing with guys like Representative Steve King, for example?
Well, we've had great success in stopping these ag-gag laws from becoming laws in 19 states where they've been introduced over the last several years. So we're winning on that front as well, as these legislators are getting the lesson that if they pass something, it's going to be unconstitutional and it's going to cost the state a lot of money to try to defend these unconstitutional laws. But nonetheless, we're still fighting them on the federal level. Yes, these are billion-dollar industries that we're talking about, and just like at the state level, they have legislators at the federal level who are willing to do their bidding. So that's difficult. The other thing too is that much of what they're doing, these laws are written in a way to target only activity in a particular state. And so the federal government regulates interstate activity, not activity purely within one state. So it would be an open question of the extent to which the federal government could or even would step in. I think there's a way they could, but the industry is that powerful. I mean, so you've got organizations like PETA, nonprofit charitable organizations, who are doing the work effectively of law enforcement to go in and discover and expose all of this cruelty. And in every case, every time we do an investigation, it's done with the purpose of taking all of the evidence, all of the video, and turning it over to the appropriate law enforcement and regulatory authorities for them to hopefully do their job and prosecute these people.
Now, PETA worked collaboratively on this case. Who else joined you in the lawsuit? PETA the lead here, or what other groups were fighting?
We have a good consortium of groups across the spectrum of interest who are implicated by this. In addition to some other animal groups, we were joined in the Iowa case by the Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement and the Center for Food Safety. And in other of our cases, we've been joined by the Government Accountability Project, the Center for Food Safety again, the Food and Water Watch, and also we've been pleased to have amicus briefs. These are so-called friend of the court briefs submitted in support of our petition by groups of journalists and other preeminent legal scholars who are supporting our position and underscoring the importance of this information to free and robust reporting, which of course is vital to our democracy.
I don't want to be an apologist for the ag industry, but could they make a case that, well, these things that PETA found, that PETA documented, could they make the case that maybe these were aberrations? You used the word routine when you were describing the litany of things that investigators found. But could it be made? Could the case be made that, hey, look, these are just one or two incidents. This isn't the norm. This isn't the way the industry works.
Yeah, that's the first refuge of the scoundrels in every one of these cases. And the first thing they do is they say, oh, these were just rogue employees. We're outraged by this. They cut the employees loose. They give some lip service to it. And then it tries to go back to business as usual, which is why these complaints and the prosecutions and the convictions are so important, because that's what will be the real deterrent. The other point that's important here is to know that in the vast majority of our investigation, management personnel themselves have been directly involved in, aware of, or supervising the cruelty as it happened. And so there's no plausible way they can claim that they didn't know about it. The other aspect that is really important to emphasize here is that that's why these investigations over a lengthy period of time are so important. Because in every one of the cases, we demonstrate, as you would expect an appropriate investigation to do, that we are documenting daily, repeated, constant, practiced activity. These are not aberrations. These are not one-offs. This is not somebody just losing their temper on a single bad day. That wouldn't excuse the conduct in any way at all either. But this is systemic conduct that is practiced every day and is known about by management personnel without question.
So PETA investigators went in the case of Iowa, they went in, there was footage, there's these activities were documented, but the court really zeroed in on the free speech of the activists and the protesters, as if vegans have a right to protest and expose this factory farming, as if that's constitutional. That's a constitutional right. I guess some meat eaters might disagree, but I mean, it seems that without the free speech angle is probably as important as the cruelty angle.
Well, in these cases, that's exactly right, because the free speech right is the constitutional right that has been upheld by these decisions. There's another constitutional protection that we've won on in some other cases, and that's what's known as equal protection. In other words, all citizens are entitled to equal protection under the law. You can't treat one group differently than another. And the equal protection aspect here relates back to what I was talking about earlier, where they were singling out PETA and animal activists generally as being the targets, clearly out of the legislators' own mouths in the state assembly, saying we're trying to stop PETA from doing this. We're trying to stop these animal activists from exposing this cruelty and giving bad PR to our industry. And that can't happen. You can't single out somebody because of our viewpoint and because we happen to hold a contrary view. And again, remember, this isn't just about philosophical differences and that sort of thing. The robust debate is important in that realm too. But this is about exposing illegal animal cruelty. And that is an important aspect of this. And that's why the public has a right to know, and why the courts are protecting our right to speak out about it by conducting these investigations.
So it's funny that the equal protection is of the people's right to know. Is that it? Versus the equal protection of the animals. I guess it's going to be a while before we get to that. Right?
Well, and Emil, hopefully our next conversation will be about exactly that. We're working, as you know, every day very hard to try to expand existing rights for animals and existing protections for animals, and we're trying to continually push the envelope as our society evolves to recognize that the pigs, cows, chickens, and other animals that end up on their plates are sentient, feeling, living beings who want nothing more than to be with their families and live in peace. So we're fighting to expand the protections for those animals every day, and we'll get there. The law changes slowly, but it does It does bend toward justice, as Martin Luther King said.
Well, let's go back just briefly to the free speech issue again. There is this idea that if a law is narrowly tailored, it could pass muster. This was just for agriculture. Isn't that narrow enough? Shouldn't that have been seen as maybe reason to uphold the Ag-Gag laws?
No, and the court specifically dealt with that. And it gets into a bit of a complex constitutional discussion. But essentially, what the court said is that these laws go too far in restricting speech. If you're trying to protect property rights of the business owners, there are other laws that already exist to do it. And there are other ways in which you can protect those rights without implicating speech at all. And that's where these laws overreach, in part, is that they preclude people from engaging in conduct that is preparatory to speech, and in some respects, in relation to trying to force people who are investigating to disclose that they're coming to do an investigation. They are trying to coerce speech or punish certain types of speech if that information isn't shared, and that the courts have held uniformly goes too far as well.
All right, so now you have this ruling in Iowa, and you have all these other proposed laws and laws existing in other states, more than 20. It would seem that there's a bull market in ag-gag laws, but now that you have this decision, does this begin to reverse that trend and maybe bring a real major victory for the animals in all those other states?
Well, and we're certainly hopeful of that. That's right. I mean, where there are other laws, we are fighting them. We currently have a case going in federal court in North Carolina, where the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal appellate court just below the Supreme Court, has allowed our case to proceed against that state's ag-gag law. And as I mentioned earlier, we've succeeded in 19 other states from preventing the laws from even being enacted. So I think that's clearly the way the tide is going. I certainly believe that the abusers will continue to try to find legislators willing to do their bidding in some other way and try to thwart PETA and other animal activists from exposing the cruelty inherent in the factory farming industry. But we'll be ready to challenge those too if they do it.
You know, what seems strange to me is the info gets out as the cloak is lifted because of these court rulings and ag-gag laws are exposed. It would seem that maybe it would bring about changes in factory farming. Maybe the factory farms would say, oh, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should treat these animals better. But does that happen? I mean, or it seems like they want to fight the law and they want to continue doing what they've always done. I mean, at some point you would think, well, maybe it's good business practice not to break the law and treat these animals terribly. But do you ever see that happen?
Well, what you have is actually now we're seeing a trend in increasingly misleading marketing claims where the industry is trying to confuse and mislead people into believing that they're actually more humane when in fact it's nothing of the sort. Things
right.
like cage-free and humane standards and all these other things, and it's a lot of bunk. And we're challenging those where we can as well. And what you see is that's a direct result of our investigations because consumers seeing our materials are outraged and they don't want that kind of cruelty to go on in the production of the things, the food that they eat. But of course, in the industrialized agriculture that we have nowadays, it's impossible to get away from it. It is part and parcel of that industry. And so that's why we're working at the other end of the spectrum to convince people of the health and environmental benefits of being vegan and staying away from these products, because that's ultimately what's going to change things. When people just stop eating those animals and the market for them, and therefore the cruelty, will will be at an end. It won't happen overnight, but we're clearly going down that road, and we're making great strides in that.
Well, and there's an example of vegan free speech rights, people speaking out, and despite these ag-gag laws, and also the other thing that comes to mind is this idea that transparency has been such a buzzword for many years. Stock market goes wrong, we want transparency. There's something going wrong in politics, people complain about, the system's rigged, we want more transparency. Right, even Donald Trump talks about transparency, although I don't think he really knows what the word means. Now we have the ag business, which is being forced to be more transparent because these ag-gag laws are really an attack on transparency. It seems that consumers want to see what's hidden, and the business continues to want to thwart that. What happens if consumers actually see what goes on in the making of their food in these factory farms?
Well, we're seeing it, as you mentioned earlier, with consumers voting with their pocketbook, and they are leaving the eating of animals in droves. Veganism is I believe, the highest, fastest growing segment of the population, and people are much more health conscious. They're also understanding, in addition to the animal cruelty aspect, the horrible environmental aspect of these factory farms with their manure lagoons and their greenhouse gas emissions, the impact they're wreaking on the environment. And factory farming and the industry as a whole is the largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And people are coming around to that idea. So it's better for their health, it's better for the environment, and it's better for the animal. And that's the direction we're headed.
And of course, if people don't see these things, it's because the industry, the ag industry, isn't as transparent as it should be, and they continue to prop up these ag-gag laws.
That's exactly right, and they're completely on the wrong side of history, and on the wrong side of where every aspect of our culture is moving, which, as you mentioned, is towards transparency and towards honesty and humaneness in the way companies do business.
So, Jeff, given this big victory in Iowa, what's the future now? Where is the next fight for you and the really, the legal warriors at PETA are really the modern animal rights activists, because now it's no longer a sign and a protester. It's a sign, a protester, and an attorney filing a lawsuit. That's the modern animal rights fight. Well, what's the next thing after Iowa?
Well, as I mentioned, we're going after the North Carolina Ag-Gag law, and we're constantly taking a look at the laws in other states and monitoring to make sure no new ones come about. But also, I and the lawyers on PETA's legal team are tasked every day with trying to bring impact litigation to try to expand the rights and protections for animals. That's a daily task for us. We're involved in over 24 current lawsuits in state and federal jurisdictions around the country, trying to enforce the laws that exist. And of course, most directly in relation to the Ag-Gag victory, it means that PETA is going to continue to do more and more investigations to expose cruelty wherever they find it, whether it be in factory farming, whether it's in laboratories where animals are tortured in useless experiments, or in places where animals are being skinned alive for their fur or their skin for a belt or a coat. So more investigations and more exposure.
Well, I'm really looking forward to your breakthroughs on applying animals to the Equal Protection Clause, illegal search and seizure, maybe even for the First Amendment on the part of animals too. I mean, I think that's, well, the protesters' First Amendment.
We give the animals voice ourselves, but your comment is actually an important one. Animals do have their own voices. It's our shortcomings that preclude us from being able to understand what they're trying to say to us. But without doubt, they have their own societies, their own cultures, their own rules. They have their own customs. They have their own way of living. They are nations unto themselves. And it's our shortcomings as human beings which preclude us from recognizing and respecting them in that regard. That's our mission at PETA.
Jeff Kerr, PETA's General Counsel and Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs at the PETA Foundation. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we talk again soon.
Thanks very much, Emil. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is a big, I know we've talked about Ag-Gag previously. We touched on it, but it's always great to talk about it, after a big victory like the one you just had. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. It's pretty major. We've got an outstanding team, and we're, because these laws are similar, one victory helps us build on to another, because we have similar arguments, similar cases, and of course our own precedents against these laws. So it really is a great, what I hope will become a tide.
Jeff Kerr, PETA Foundation General Counsel and Senior VP of Corporate Affairs, on the victory over the Iowa Ag-Gag law and how it may begin a trend of reversing these laws, which are a blatant attempt to silence animal rights activists, a clear violation of constitutional First Amendment rights. One federal court in Iowa agreed, and now the fight continues to reverse or stop similar laws across the nation. For links to more information, go to our show notes or go to PETA.org. And that's our program for today. You can contact us at PETA.org. Find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or on AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Hey, and on January 27th, February 1st, and February 7th, I do a one-man show about Filipinos in America, Emil Amok, Sex and Affirmative Action, another chapter in our nation's race conversation. It's funny and not, sort of like life. It's at the Potrero stage in San Francisco. Go to AMOK.com for details. And that's it for our show today. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.